Present, she lives in Mumbai and works with a publication that deals with policy and CSR. Welcome to the Excite Kolkata Literary Meet.
Hi. Thank you, Sanjana, for introducing all three of us so that I don't have to. But I should tell you very briefly, the two books that we're looking at here are River Traveller and Saraswati. River Traveller is written by Sanjoy Hazarika, and Gurnaik has written Saraswati, as you have gleaned from now, from this conversation. But let me jump right into it. So these seemingly disparate books, which seem to have only the river as a common factor, actually have quite a few commonalities as well. While Gurnaik's work is like a fictionalized imagining of the reappearance of the Saraswati River, Sanjoy has written about the Brahmaputra. He's traveled extensively in that area, and he talks about the river, the origins, all of that, the life along the river. So before I take it across to them, since our session is called River Muse, please tell us, Sanjoy, let's start with you, how the idea for the book came about.
Well, I think the book was always in my mind and, shall I say, in my heart, because my first remembrance as a child of the river is going down to a river bank in Guwahati, with my parents and my brother, and seeing dolphins dancing. So I think that was the trigger. I think that and the first memory, shall we say, one of the earliest memories of a great river, what appeared to me a great river steamer, you know, with a large wheel moving across from a town in a port in Upper Assam to the northern bank. So these sort of always played in my mind. And then there was a film we were making on the Brahmaputra with Jahanu Boro, and I think that became the backbone, as the spine of the book, because it took me to many places I had not been. So that made me feel that there is something to be written here from a perspective that is both local and regional, and perhaps international, and you know, but which should not be just and I can't write academic tracks, you know. So it's both history, mystery, geography, you know, love, romance, in the whole shebang. So that I thought made it interesting for me to write the book, and which drove me really.
Gurnaik, let me ask you the same question. And yours is also very interesting because you've imagined the emergence of the Saraswati. You know, that's a river very close to our heart. We've all wondered about it. You know, where has it gone? And in your book, it actually makes a reappearance, and then the whole thing plays out from there. So tell me, how did you think about that? Why the Saraswati, and how did this idea come to you?
Yeah, I think I started thinking about the book after my grandfather died, and we were sort of going through the process of taking his ashes back to Punjab to scatter in one of the rivers, and just thinking of, you know, this sort of tradition, I suppose, of the dead ending up in the rivers. And at that time, there were news stories of certain rivers in India being declared dead due to pollution. For example, the Yamuna, there was this sort of toxic foam building on it. It was in the news at the same time. So there seemed to be some discordance there between the sort of the faith aspect, but also the ecological aspect, which were both two things that were very interesting to me. So I was sort of circling around this idea, and at that time then there were news stories about supposed sightings of the Saraswati, like water returning along its ancient route in the paleo channels that still exist under the ground. And it just struck me as this perfect, like, what if moment, you know, what if the government decided to bring that river back as a kind of sort of thing that might rally the nation. And I wanted to take it from that moment of sort of creation or birth to what might its sort of logical end be, which would be that if water were to be returned along that route, it would drain away maybe from the rivers that flow across the border into Pakistan. And in a sense, a sort of act of national myth-making might be an act of war. So the book sort of takes it, that's the general sweep of it, from, a moment of sort of, beauty to something like the Indus Waters Treaty being broken.
We'll come back to that in a minute. Circle back to the fact of the act of war. You've certainly framed one of my questions for me. But let me ask both of you, and again, we'll start with you, Sanjada. There are some very strong common points between both the books. One of them being this whole idea of the origin of the river. The Sangpo Brahmaputra starts somewhere in Tibet. The Saraswati supposedly starts somewhere in Mansarovar or Kailash, the Kailash Mountains. Tell me a little bit about your research into that, Sanjada, and the fact that you have mentioned about how people are on this quest to find the origin of the river, hidden most specifically in the book. But tell me a little bit about how that plays out.
See, in the 19th century, this was one of the great mysteries which confronted the Royal Geographic Society, which confronted many Europeans and geographers and others, saying that there is one great unsolved mystery in this world, geographical mystery, which is we don't know where the Brahmaputra begins. They knew the Brahmaputra, they knew also about the Sangpo, but there was no clue whether these were one river or two separate rivers, where they flowed, where they originated. And for that, you had a variety of very strange, adventurous, reckless even characters, spies, who went on missions to find out what this was. I mean, Sven Hedin, for instance, the Swedish explorer, was the one who is credited with sourcing, the scientific sourcing of the Brahmaputra and the Sangpo and the pinpointing the glaciers. He talked about mountains of ice and breaking, racket that they made as he, located this place. But then the British were quite amazing, because what they did was they employed, to get into Tibet was very, very hard. It was the forbidden land, and you couldn't just get in. The Tibetans, although they had a weak army, just didn't allow visitors. And the British were not going to be put off. So they employed, among other things, Pandits from what is today's Uttarakhand, who could speak Tibetan, trained them in survey work, but also trained them as spies. So these Pandits would go into Tibet as traders or as mendicants, and would travel extensively to not just to locate the Brahmaputra, but to see what kind of trade was available, the routes for caravans, etc. And to me, that was quite a remarkable odyssey of these people walking hundreds of kilometers. In one particular case, one of the Pandits walked 2,000 kilometers, started at one end of Tibet and exited towards Sikkim. And they were extremely fit. And one of the things that I found fascinating was that in their prayer wheel, we are all familiar with the prayer wheel, inside there would be a piece of paper which would enable them to measure the paces, count their paces, how many paces they had walked during the day. That was one. The second thing was the Tibetan rosary is usually 108 beads. This had 100. So in many ways, because they couldn't afford to be caught, they'd be tortured and so on and imprisoned, they found ingenious ways of mapping this terrain. And one last part, if I may just win, there was a man called Kinthup, who was a tailor, and he was charged expressly with, an ingenious plan, which was to chop pieces of wood every day and toss it into the Sangpo. There'd be a party waiting downstream in India, in what is now Arunachal Pradesh, So the bits of wood appeared, they're not bits, they were large pieces of wood, appeared, you know, it would be confirmation that this was one river. It was quite ingenious, but, you know, fate disposes otherwise. So Kintub landed up as a slave. Then the person who sent him out was transferred from India. Everybody lost interest, thought he was dead or lost or whatever. So when he was finally able to chop the wood and toss it into the river, there was nobody waiting for it. But anyway, so that's one of the many stories which are almost like legends of the finding, shall we say. And the rivers always existed, the Tibetans have known it.
Right.
But in the colonial Western interpretation of things, it was discovered that way.
But is it true that the mapping, the actual full mapping of the river has happened as late as 2000?
Well, the mapping has taken place over a period of time. I don't think 2000 is accurate.
Okay.
It's really the full mapping, I think, by the beginning of the 20th century, by the 1930s, much of it was done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting intel gathering process. And many of them didn't make it back alive either, right? I mean,
no. Most of them made it back alive, but
unrecognizable because of their weight loss and
some of them were honored. Kintub was not honored until almost the end, because and he was very sick, and he was given 1,000 rupees because I couldn't give him a medal like the others had received.
Right.
Because you know, he was originally from Darjeeling or somewhere. So some of the stories are written in tragedy.
Right.
You know, so that's how it goes.
Right. Gurnaik, I want to ask you, so in your book, again, two of your characters, Katrina and Jay, they, just as a new adventure, they set out to find what is the origin of the Saraswati, the supposed origin of the Saraswati. Tell me how that plays out.
Yeah, so supposedly it starts at Mount Kailash, which is, you know, seen as the sort of center of the world in multiple faiths. So it felt like when I was in the research and I was reading about this mountain, it felt like, okay, I kind of have to go there at some point. Sure. And also I think one of the sort of texts that informs my novel is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And that's sort of, what I love about that is the tension of sort of starting at the sea and moving gradually against the current towards the source of the river. So it always felt like I would have some element of finding the source, I suppose, just in the structure of the book. But what I found actually is it turned out that the novel, the shape of it, follows from the sort of first sighting of the river to its final, you know, sort of state as this massive engineering project that's come to fruition. So you're sort of starting at the source and going to the sea. But the family story that informs much of the book is, in sense, a journey the other way around, where we see 7 distantly related characters in the present day, finding out about their family, and one of the characters is almost investigating the story of the family and trying to piece together a family tree. So in that sense, they're going back to the source. And should I pause?
No, I think we just have to.
Okay.
We'll have to just power through this.
Yes. And early on, I sort of drew a sort of map of the 7 rivers around Punjab with the Indus and this proposed Saraswati. And I was trying to trace them back to a place where they converge, I suppose. And what I saw was in that a sort of inverted family tree. So
you've given us a family river, actually.
Yeah.
Most of us have a family tree, but you've given us a family river.
Yeah, exactly. It felt maybe a bit more, a better metaphor, at least for the book.
Okay. But also interesting, please share with the audience how the members of the family find each other. They are flung all across the globe in various places. How do they locate each other and come together as descendants of the original couple, Sejal and Jugaad? Yeah,
so I sort of make a kind of folk tale out of the love story between Sejal and Jugaad, and they're sort of cursed because they turned their back on their parents. Right. In the story, that their children would turn their backs on them. And over the course of history, through the sort of machinations of empire, each of their 7 children ended up in different corners of the globe of the British Empire. So when we meet them, their descendants in present day, we have characters in Kenya and Mauritius, in Canada, and so on. And yeah, so the one character basically uses this sort of fictional app called Helix in the book, which is a sort of version of 23andMe or Ancestry.com. And in that, it's supposed technology allows for finding out who your ancestors were 7 generations back. Well, not finding out who they were, sorry, but finding common
Threads.
common, yeah, sort of descendants who match your sort of DNA records. And through the sort of this technological advancement, they're able to start to connect the dots, I suppose.
Right.
So it was a useful key to open the lock that I'd created for myself.
I mean, I was very excited about it because we don't have an Ancestry.com in India, and I would love to trace my ancestors back to God knows how many generations, and I know that would happen with all of us. We'd go back hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's definitely something that that you've looked at. But also in your book, for both of you, there's always a lot of politics around the river, around water sharing, governments trying to take control. Tell me how that works out. Chandrada, in your case, Tibet and China, and the Brahmaputra somehow caught in the middle of that. And then it comes to India, Bangladesh, Arunachal, all of that. Please tell me the background, the political background against which you've set your book.
See, most governments and engineers, and I apologize to the engineers who are here, especially Heidelberg engineers, see the river as a resource to be exploited. They don't see as an entity by itself. You know, I mean, we have something called the national highways, but we also have the national waterways. So the Brahmaputra is waterway number 2. But the number of dams that are being built, not just upstream, but across the Himalayan landscape, not just in China, which we hear a lot about, but across India, Nepal, right from Kashmir to Arunachal Pradesh, is mind-boggling. So I think everybody wants to claim the water and the energy that flows from the water as their own, but they won't take any responsibility for the care or the environmental impacts of what they're doing. That's one. The second
Sorry,
thing,
I just want to interrupt there. Do you have a sense of how many kilometers of dam we're talking about? The river itself is about 2,900 kilometers, right?
it's about 3,000.
3,000. If we put the dams one, next to each other, how many kilometers would we be looking at?
I don't know, but we are talking about 400 dams on the Indian side.
400?
From
Just on the Indian side?
Indian and Nepal, all the way
Okay.
there, plus the Chinese.
Wow.
So that's a lot of dams. And you see, I think that we have to regard the river as a living entity for a very simple reason. You're trying to exploit it, but everybody uses the rivers, the water of the rivers, in the sense that the farmers use it. You have an ecological space, which is very important. You know, fish, dolphins, water which is used for irrigation, and so on. And still, I mean, if anybody goes to Guwahati or why to Guwahati, even on the Hooghly, you see the amount of, shall I say, corruption of the water that takes place, you know, the destruction of what is very precious commons. And I think all countries, I think whether it's China, India, or Bangladesh, all seek to exploit it to the maximum without regard for the consequences, forgetting that each is dependent on the other. I mean, the river flows from China, Tibet, into India, which flows into Bangladesh. But there is no law which governs how countries can use rivers. There is a law of the sea, the Law of the Sea Convention, but there is no such internationally accepted convention for rivers.
Okay.
So that's a real issue, that's a real problem.
Gurnaik, I'm convinced that when you finished writing the book, you probably called up the Prime Minister of India and tipped him off about what he can do with the Indus waters. Because soon after your book came out, this Indus Treaty was put in abeyance. But, jokes aside, tell me a little bit about how you have dealt with that, the water sharing issue in your book.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't embarrass you.
No. I think early on in the research, I came across this quote about the Indus. It was during the time of partition when the sort of World Bank was sort of involved, and one of their workers said the Indus pays no attention to, I think, either to partition or to borders. It just carries on rolling along. And that put me in mind of that Paul Robeson song, Old Man River, a kind of classic. And there's a great Assamese version as well.
Which is also mentioned in Sanjoy's book, by the way.
Of course.
Bhupen Hazarika has an Assamese version of the song, yeah.
Yeah, which is great. So these kind of borders or these sort of man-made ideas of stuff, but water is its own sort of, beast. But it is being tamed in a very scary way with dams and so on. And at the time of writing the book, there was a lot of talk about in America, for example, the Colorado, where essentially everyone had been drawing their share of the river earlier and earlier in the season, so that it no longer reached anywhere near the sea. And what happened is what they call a run on the river, in the same sense that there could be a run on the bank, right? So if we all have savings in the same bank, and then on the same day I rush to the bank to take out my £100, and so do you, and so do you, and so do you. The bank doesn't have enough money for everyone, right? So we need to rethink our ways of sharing water, where we're putting communities first, rather than profit, I suppose.
But you have actually also talked about what the Pakistan ambassador at the UN calls the weaponization of water. Both of you have mentioned water being used as a way to control, as a form of control by various governments, whether you allow it, whether you dam it, or you don't allow it to go into the neighboring country, whether you don't share it between states. Again, this is a very complex idea that you have included in your narrative, in a way. How did you think that fit in with the larger story of the family?
Yeah, I think on the zoomed out scale, there are these ideas of sort of water conflicts around the world, whether it's along the Nile or along the Indian rivers, or in Singapore and Malaysia, the water sharing there, where there is just a natural power that the upstream country has over their downstream neighbor. And I remember being terrified researching this thing called a water bomb, which is that if the river was dammed up enough, a country could hold back the flow and then release it all at once and wash out the land on the other side of the border. And these things were terrifying, but I think to understand them, I had to look at it also at a granular level of what water sharing means. So there's a scene in one chapter of the book where a sort of farmer, he's got too many mouths to feed on his land, and the rains have been poor or whatnot. So while his neighbor is away, he basically creates a very small dam on the irrigation canal, so that to sort of double the flow on his side and stop
channels it off to his field.
Yes, exactly. And just in that small gesture, I sort of understood maybe what's sort of happening on a wider scale when we're talking about nations.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Can I just make a quick point?
Yes,
2 points. One is that often we forget, but then occasionally we're reminded, as Mr. Chaudhary was talking about earthquakes, this afternoon in his story of his life. This is the most seismic, earthquake-prone region in the world, the Himalaya, Tibetan belt, shall we say, where the two Asian and European plates grind against each other, building the Himalayas, creating ripples of earthquakes. And to build dams, on such gigantic scale, on such a gigantic scale on
tectonic plates,
in these areas is really asking for trouble. That's one. The other thing is that the life of a dam is usually said to be about 100 years, but in the Himalayan areas, whether you're talking about Nepal or the Indian Himalayas, speed and velocity of the river as well as the sediment it carries is so huge that the dam's, the lifespan is about 50 years. So how much are you actually gaining from all this? Then to clean the sediment and all that takes a heck of a lot of time and money and energy. So these are questions that people don't seem to be thinking about settling in government.
Right. I mean, you're going to spend more cleaning and maintaining the dam than if you were to set it up. Is that?
Well, that's one of the things. The other thing is that engineers will know this, that when you build a dam, energy is generated by the water flowing through the turbines. Now, you can't have rocks and sediment, major sediment flowing through the turbines because it damages the turbine. So essentially what you have to do is clean the water before it comes into the generating unit and then release it. So what you're releasing is a river which is devoid of natural nourishment, the nutrients,
right.
which it'll pick it up as it goes along, but then if there's another dam downstream, it won't. So these are the basic challenges that people don't think about both in the short term or the long term.
In your book, you've also talked about this coming down of the dams and the water from the glaciers overwhelming what you're trying to say, that once it becomes too large and too unwieldy, too much volume, it is going to break through. What I wanted to ask you was this, just as an extension to what we are discussing, man's attempt, this whole folly to create or tame this very wild beast called the river, a big, big, mighty river like the Sangpo Brahmaputra or the Saraswati. Where are we going with this? When are we going to stop and think? Like you said, we don't think about these things. When are we going to stop and think? When is it too much? And it will give us pause to think about it differently.
It's already too much. And we are not pausing to think. We're just going on as if it's the same old story. When we're not learning, it's not rocket science. You build a structure like that which doesn't have the possibility, the ability to survive a major earthquake of 8.5, 8.7 on the Richter scale, it will break. And even like in Sikkim a few years ago, I think 3 years ago, you had the glacial lake which burst.
Yes.
And it destroyed 2 dams, not one, but 2 dams. It just wiped them out. And it killed, we still don't know how many people it killed because it caught everybody unawares. And if you went there even a few months afterwards, as I did, you will see the high mark of the water and things like this earth movers and all, they're just tossed like toys. So climate change is affecting everything and we are not building that into the scenario. It's not really a very good scientific approach that we're taking, quite apart from the issue of environment and ecosystems.
I just want to pivot a little bit from that and talk to both of you about the river as a nurturer. The river, and again, Chandrada, in your book, you've talked about how you're watching from a height where you can see these mud flats and sand flats that have been created by the alluvium brought down by the river. It has its own ecosystem, it has its own economy. Tell me a little bit about the milk trade, the boat clinics, for instance. I know that you have set up an organization which set up boat clinics, for instance. What was the reason, for instance, of the inflection point at which you decided that, yes, we must have boat clinics as well because these are people who cannot be reached. They're very far away. They have medical emergencies. Tell me a little bit about that, please.
See, I think in each of our lives, there comes a tipping point, a point where you say, I need to do this. This is a decision I need to take, because it's important, you feel, to yourself, maybe to others. So while I was making this film with Janu Bora, we were on a ferry going to Majuli, the great island in the heart of the river. And on that, we heard the story of this young woman who died in childbirth because she couldn't get to a hospital on time. She had been on the same ferry. We were going back and she was coming out. She had been coming out. And you found it a bit more. I'm a journalist. You dig a bit deep, then you find that this is a woman in her teens with a very difficult pregnancy, they couldn't make the evening ferry, they missed it, so he had to spend the night by the banks of the river. And by the banks of the Brahmaputra is a river that roars. It roars like a tiger, and it's misty and damp and cold. And the next morning they caught the ferry, but she didn't survive. So I thought there were two deaths, the child which was not born and the mother. And I said to myself, why is this happening in Assam? You know, and then I did a bit more research. And I found that in Assam, something like 2.5 million people, that's about 10% of the population lived on islands. And most of them did not have access to health and education.
Healthcare facilities.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and then you also saw that in Assam, the most dangerous place for a young woman who's pregnant to be was in a rural area. It's the most dangerous place to be because Assam had the highest maternal mortality ratio in the country, 493 out of 1 lakh live births. So then it's not Eureka. No? You cannot build bridges everywhere. You can't take flights. There are no flying doctors. You have to build boats that take healthcare to people who need it. And this is the most vulnerable, geographically isolated and poor communities who live on these islands, and they're right through the river. So that's how we started. We won a small award. There was a World Bank competition. The World Bank is also useful sometimes, does these things. So a small grant, we built the first boat, and then we collaborated with the district administration. Now we have 15 boats.
Oh, wonderful.
We reach about 2.5 lakh people every year. We partner the state government of Assam through the National Health Mission. And we have approximately 250 staff. That's doctors, nurses, and pharmacists. And so it's a complete floating health clinic on the water. And we've just finished a hospital ship, which will be the first hospital ship in India on the river.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. Okay. Actually, there's something else I wanted to ask you. I wanted you to share that story about the milk trade and how the milk used to be carried from point to point in that same ferry that you were traveling in. Please tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, this was some time ago. So I used to take the ferry to go from a place called Dibrugarh, town of Dibrugarh, tea center, up to Arunachal Pradesh. And the journey would take about 9 hours. And there would be these large barrels which were empty. There were those diesel, barrels, they were empty. Then on the way back, you'll find that they were full of milk. So this was essentially how Dibrugarh got supplied with milk, because there wasn't enough local production. This was an additional thing. And there was no chilling facilities or anything. If anything fell into the milk, it would fall. There was no cover. And I remember once a little dugout was coming at a great pace because the river is quite fast. It was coming along, and the larger ferry slowed down. And I still have this image in my mind. There was a guy from the dugout. He held up a pail of milk, and the guy picked it up and went and poured it into the can,
The guy from the ferry picked it up.
So it ran on the basis of trust, because everybody would be paid at the end of the journey, once the accounts were made and all this. But
what if the milk went bad? Or like you said, if something fell in it because it wasn't even covered?
Well, that's a risk you take, no? Especially in the warm seasons. It did okay in the winter seasons. But in the warmer season with rain and all that, it's a bit dicey. I had suggested to NDDB, the National Dairy Development Board, that they do a boat with a chilling facility, but they never got beyond the discussion stage.
Okay. Gurnaik, I want to come back to you and ask you a little bit about, we were discussing faith in a way. I mean, the faith that the milk that would reach you would be unspoiled and you would be able to use it. faith about, meeting the hospital, the boat clinic, and somehow making it. In your book, right at the beginning, there's this thing when the water in the well comes up, the level of the water is rising. A lot of people gather from the nearby villages to have access to the water because they have maybe a disability or an illness or something. And there's a band of people who's exploiting that. Please tell us that little story.
Yes.
Starting with that priest, I've forgotten his name though. Sorry, what was his name?
Oh, I've forgotten too.
Oh, you've forgotten too. Okay.
But yeah, so this is sort of set in rural Punjab where a lot of the farms are dependent on these sort of, reaching into the aquifer with these tube pumps, and they're like sort of lengthening each year or every few years because the aquifer is getting more and more depressed as time goes on. And this is sort of like using a finite source as if it's infinite, I suppose.
Right.
So obviously a lot of the old wells in the area are sort of dry, and in the story, this is a sort of well that's been dry for generations. So the arrival of water in it is just naturally seen as a kind of, surreal thing, maybe spiritual thing.
Sorry, how do they figure out that it might be the Saraswati?
Well, these sort of people who are part of a research group sponsored by government into the Saraswati River have sort of mapped out its paleo channels, and they sort of posit that this well is along that route. So it's sort of the first sign, I suppose, of the idea of water maybe returning. But it's sort of open for interpretation if that water's flooding that route underneath the ground because the glaciers in the Himalayas are melting so quickly at the moment. So we can sort of see those glaciers as a kind of water tower that over 1 billion people rely upon. So while it's seen as a kind of, great miracle almost in the book, it's also the sign of a land in its death throes. And yeah, it just making me think of part in the book which was inspired by this German river where they found these they're called hunger stones. And it would be like if the level of the water sunk in the river and you could see the stone where someone's carved, if you see this, weep. So it would sort of prove that if the water ever sunk to that level, you would be in a time of famine. There were lakes around the world where you can literally see the history of climate change happening and speeding up by the water level sinking and revealing new things. And I think that's the kind of strange tension that I wanted to explore, especially writing about a river, it's these things that both give and nourish, but also take. Right. One character kind of quips, half the world has too much water and half the world not enough. And it's a constant toing and froing between, drought and flood, and that informs a lot of the livelihoods of characters in the book.
I wanted to actually talk to you about that cottage industry of faith, where he keeps taking water out from the well and handing it to people. Tell us a little bit about that little incident.
Yeah, I think...
right at the beginning.
Yeah, right. I just think it's, it's a sort of sweet thing, I suppose. If people believe that this will help, then that's great. But I suppose I wanted to show how quickly a good thing can be corrupted by people who sort of seize on the opportunity, I suppose. And then very quickly, the character who is sort of maybe advertising that there's this water that might help you.
Miracle water.
Yeah, and in one scene, he actually, claims that it's going to help a child to speak, right? Because this is water related to the river of the Saraswati, who's the goddess of speech. And yeah, I just wanted to play, I suppose, in a sort of micro level of what might happen on a macro scale with the story of the river.
Sure. Chandra, just to get back to you, and this will be my last question because I've just been signaled to close the session. You have this very, very disturbing episode in your book about how the British decimated a whole native population along the river, the Abours. Tell us a little bit about that slight that set it off and how the full might of the empire came around to squash this little bug as they saw it.
Well, essentially, if I recall it right, the British officer sent a kind of message which was in the telling of the story or the message, the messenger, I think, misinterpreted the message, and it was subsequently also misunderstood by the group that he was speaking to. And as a result, this particular group, the Abor tribe, the chief felt very insulted, and there was an attack as a consequence on the British officers and a doctor. They were killed. A large number of the retinue were barely escaped with their lives, swam across the river and so on. And the British mobilized a force. They drew people from different parts of India. They brought cannon, they brought not just obviously muskets and they assembled a fleet to go up the river and attack, you know. But the river ain't behaving, you know. The river, there was a flood. So the whole plan had to be set back, and they had to go in the winter. And the Abors were not taking things lying down. They were brilliant technicians and guerrilla fighters. So there is a history of guerrilla warfare in the Northeast. So the British found this very hard going. They would find themselves almost face to face with the village only when they were there. And the villages were built right on the edge of the cliff. So in between a rock and a hard place kind of thing. But finally, because of sheer force of numbers and you know, superior weaponry, you know, they had gunpowder. That they forced the Abors to capitulate. But that is regarded by the, in Arunachal as one of the first wars of India's independence. You know, but the river was used, you know, in an earlier time to fight against the Mughals, and they were defeated in the 17th century. And here the British used it to try and capture what they regarded as a rebellion against their their worldview.
Right. I just want to close with your little encounter on the river with the pirates. Please tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, that was in the sea, in the Bay of Bengal. See, what was happening was we had finished filming for the documentary. By the way, it's called A River Story: The Quest for the Brahmaputra. So you can find it on YouTube, and it's directed by Janu Baro. So it was a lovely evening. The musicians had finished singing, and the sun was setting. It was absolutely like picture perfect. And then I looked around and I could see no land because we were near the land when we started shooting. Then I asked the captain, I said, where are we? He says, sir, we are in the Bay of Bengal. I said, how far from shore are we, land? He says, quite far. You know how people speak in colloquial terms. I said, how long will it take to get there? He says, several hours, nothing specific. So I was getting worried it's going to get dark, you know, and I don't swim. I've traveled on the river from Tibet to the, I don't swim. So, you know, the river gods should have mercy. And then suddenly there was a hullabaloo, and we were told to move the cameras down to the hold, and everybody sort of hide and so on. So I was even more curious. I said, what happened? What's happening? He said, we're being chased by pirates. So I said, you're joking. I mean, in the 20th century, we are being chased by pirates in
Which year was this?
This was in 2000, about 2000. So, and those guys are still around, you know. It's a parallel economy. So I said, how on earth, first of all, how did we get here in the first place? No land. He says, sir, your director told me, cut the engine, no sound. So I cut the engine. The river doesn't wait, no. The river is flowing.
Into the sea.
The river is flowing. The current is taking us into the sea. So why are you blaming me, kind of thing, you know? So I said, you know, what happens if they capture us? There were 3 ships chasing us, you know, right, left, and center, kind of thing. And he says, well, they kill everybody on board, they loot everything, and then they scuttle the ship. I said, okay, ho gaya abhi. Brand was, I told Jahano, I said, tomorrow will be a small item in the Times of India. So, you know, journalist and filmmaker disappear. So, but we made it back because ours was a smaller vessel and the other three were quite large. And the captain maneuvered the our boat closer to the shore when we were getting there, which is shallower. So not to be repeated, but it was an interesting experience.
So the larger boats couldn't follow you. The pirate ship, the boats couldn't follow you into the...
Get the book. Read the rest. I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story.
Fine. Well, then on that note, please get the book, read the rest, like Sanjoy said. We're going to have to close the session, but we'll take a few questions. Do we have, Sanjana, do we have time for? Yes, okay. Please, yes, lady in front.
My name is Sharbari Chowdhury. Sanjoy, this question is for you. Brahmaputra is supposed to be a male river. Do you have any explanation as to why or how did this come about, or do you mention this in your book?
Brahmaputra, no? The son of Brahma. I mean, one of the stories is that of Parshuram, you know, who actually pops up in Goa and all sorts of places, even in the Budi Ganga in Dhaka. And now, the story is that Parshuram was afflicted with the curse of matricide, no? Because he killed his mother to placate his father, the Rishi, and the axe had stuck to his hand, and he went everywhere, prayers, nothing would make the axe leave his hand. Then he was told to bathe in a kund from where the Brahmaputra flows. It's called the Lohit there in Arunachal. He bathed there and the axe fell from his hand. I mean, these are all mythologies, so there are other people who can explain it better. And he says that it is said that with one great blow of his axe, he paved the way, he cleared the path for the river to flow into the plains. So that's one of the stories. I don't know if it explains the male thing. There are other, the Son is also a male river. It's not as if the Assamese will be upset when I say this, but the Brahmaputra is not the only quote male river. But then, there we are.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, I guess then we'll close the session. Thank you so much, Sanjay. Thank you so much, Gurnaik. Both are very, very interesting books. I would highly recommend that you pick them up, and we haven't done justice to it, I think. This is just the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. Sorry, you had a question? Would you sign? Are they signing books? Gurnaik and Sanjay?
Yeah,
Yes.
If you buy it, I'll sign it. You have to buy it. Yeah, you have a book. I'll sign it definitely.
Okay. So are we doing that after this session, or? Okay. So yes, to answer your question, we'll be doing it immediately after. But thank you so much for joining us and for regaling us with these very, very interesting and different kind of stories. We look forward to more very, very interesting things from both of you. Your book on Mizoram, and Gurnaik, I'm sure there'll be one from you soon as well. So thank you. Thank you to the audience as well, and to the Literary Meet for having us and hosting this wonderful session. Thank you.